Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Let's talk about U.S. history, primarily Chapter 25, where we'll talk about the 1950s. And let's start with presidency. In the 1952 presidential nomination, there was a lot of difficult decisions regarding who would be nominated for each party. Even with an addition of the 22nd Amendment, President Harry Truman decided not to run, even though he could have, despite the two-term limitation of the 22nd Amendment. The Democrats decided to go with Illinois Governor Adlai Stevenson, and to bring the party back from his previous split, John Sparkman, who was a liberal governor, was nominated as vice president. Now, the Republicans wanted to go with Robert A. Taft. And yes, if that name sounds familiar, it's because it is. He is the son. Robert A. Taft was the son of President William Howard Taft. Robert A. Taft was the son of President William Howard Taft, but Dwight D. Eisenhower was far more popular as a candidate. Thus, Eisenhower was nominated with Richard Nixon as his vice president. Eisenhower's military history helped endear him to the public greatly. He had served in World War II as Supreme Commander. After World War II, he served as Army Chief of Staff. And then he served as Commander of NATO in 1951. During the 1952 presidential election on September 18th, 1952, an $18,000 fund for Nixon's political work was revealed. This was a fund made up of by individual contributors to help with expenses involved in Nixon's political work. Nixon was heavily criticized for this fund. It appeared to be a fund which could have been used for unidentifiable purposes, and one for which nobody was accountable. In response, Nixon decided to go on national television and explain his position in a 30-minute presentation paid for by the Republican National Committee. On September 23rd, he talked heavily about his funding he had received, which included a family dog named Checkers that he planned on keeping. This speech became known as the Checkers speech, and gave Nixon a very positive, almost overwhelmingly so, regard amongst the voting populace. Letters, calls, and telegrams to the Republican National Convention came in from television networks and such immediately after this speech. It's no surprise, then, that Eisenhower won the 1952 election. But Eisenhower won by a majority even. 442 to 89 in the Electoral College count, and 33.9 million to 27.3 million in popular votes. Even with this change, the Republicans only had a slim majority in Congress, which they lost in the 1954 midterm election. When we talk about Eisenhower as a leader, Eisenhower was a very quiet leader, working primarily in the background. He encouraged the growth of private businesses. He favored a private power company over TVA in one decision, and supported the private development of atomic energy in another. Eisenhower also primarily chose businessmen to serve as his cabinet. The new president was primarily fiscally conservative, and worked incredibly hard to achieve a balanced budget. He vetoed wage hikes for federal workers, and tax cuts passed by Congress to stimulate the economy during a recession. Regardless of this, inflation was kept low during this period, despite 2 mild recessions during his term. The basic structure of the New Deal that had developed remained largely unchanged. The basic structure of an active federal government went largely unchallenged during this point in time. Another interesting development during Eisenhower's presidency was the owning of automobiles. By 1955, Americans owned about 61 million automobiles and trucks, but they did not have good road infrastructure in place. When Dwight Eisenhower had participated in a cross-country excursion of tanks and other military equipment on the Lincoln Highway in 1919, it greatly dramatized to him the need for better roads, especially once he saw and admired the Autobahn system in Germany, which made travel and troop movement incredibly easy. President Eisenhower pressed for a system of wide, limited access interstate highways to facilitate the public and military transportation. This became known as the Federal Highway Act that was passed in 1956, creating 42,000 miles of interstate road, much of which is still in use today. Now, whenever we talk about labor unions, during Eisenhower's term as president, it was found that criminal activity was happening in these labor unions. One result was the Labor Management Reporting and Disclosure Act of 1959 of these investigations. One result was the Labor Management Reporting and Disclosure Act of 1959. This act protected union members from pressure by leadership, required disclosure of leader salaries, and forced regular elections for union officials, along with outlawing excessive charges for routine work. The American Federation of Labor and the Congress of Industrial Organizations merged at this point to increase the power of unions rather than splitting them between two separate groups. All in all, the AFL-CIO ended up representing about 15 million industrial workers, but not all of the unionized laborers in the country. Eisenhower did have a heart attack in 1955, but he ended up running for the 1956 election, with Nixon again serving as his vice president. Whenever this second race ended up coming up, the Democrats renominated Adlai Stevenson and had Estes Kefauver for their ticket. The country continued to like Ike, and Dwight D. Eisenhower won by a landslide, with a 457 to 33 electoral majority and a 35.6 million to 26 million popular vote victory. However, Eisenhower failed to carry one house of Congress with him, and both houses were democratically controlled at this time. He was the first candidate since 1948 to be elected president without carrying at least one house of Congress with him. After this period, Eisenhower retired. Oh, hi. Hold on. Sorry, I have a cat that wants to go out. There you go, Zelda. Go ahead, Zelda. Well, you gonna stay in? I guess you're gonna stay in. Stop it. Eisenhower retired after a nationally televised farewell speech to a farm near Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. He passed away on March 28th, 1969, and a eulogy was given by the new president, Richard Nixon. Nixon at the time. So let's go ahead and let's talk about the Civil Rights Movement, which I accidentally skipped through a little bit. Hold on. So whenever we talk about the Civil Rights Movement, relationship between white people and African American people had been difficult since the first slaves were brought to the colonies in 1619. Slavery had ended with the Civil War, but was replaced with systematic and institutional segregation and racism. Plessy v. Ferguson had declared that separate but equal facilities were acceptable, but there were many attempts to challenge this decision. Brown v. the Board of Education was the first decision in this fight. Brown v. the Board of Education was a group of lawsuits brought under one Supreme Court decision. These were cases involving racially segregated school districts in Kansas, South Carolina, Virginia, and Delaware. Each of these involved a separate case in which an African American school was thought to not be equal, and the fact that they were required to be separate made them unequal to begin with. May 17th, 1954, saw the Supreme Court issue a unanimous decision that the separate but equal doctrines had no place in public education. Local school boards responded with firm resistance to any change regarding the addition of African American students. often slowing desegregation plans until they were forced to comply. This resistance also included 100 U.S. senators and congressmen, whose opposition led to their declaration being called the Southern Manifesto. Attempts to integrate local schools sometimes led to violence, such as in Clinton, Tennessee, where a school was forced to desegregate in 1956, with 12 African American students entering the school. About 1,500 white adults gathered at the courthouse to protest this change. Some of them had come from as far away as New Jersey and Alabama, with about 80 reporters from around the country coming together to report on this incident. The Tennessee governor at this point in time, whose name was Frank Clement, ordered 600 National Guardsmen to maintain order. The integration proceeded, and Bobby Kane Jr. was the lone black senior to graduate in the spring of 1957. The resistance to this change ended up with, over a year later, in October of 1958, a bomb exploding at Clinton High School on a Sunday morning. The people who planted that bomb wanted to stop integration, but the effect of that incident was to make more people in Clinton want to stop the violence that was taking place. Another integration attempt happened in Little Rock, Arkansas, where 9 African American students, referred to as the Little Rock Nine, were enrolled in Central High School in 1957. Governor Orwell Faubus called in out the National Guard to prevent enrollment from taking place. President Eisenhower met with Faubus, but the meeting didn't help. A court ordered the government to remove the troops and allow the students to go in, but a mob of white people posed such a threat to the black students that they were withdrawn. Eisenhower then sent in 1,000 paratroopers to protect the students, and the Arkansas National Guard to protect the students for the rest of the year. The use of force required in these and several other cases to accomplish integration, hardened opposition to these desegregation attempts. However, it wasn't until the U.S. Justice Department began filing legal suits that true significant changes took place at this point in time. And it wasn't just occurring in schools either. In Montgomery, Alabama, like many cities, it was not a school that saw a revolution, but public transportation. African Americans began protesting an ordinance in the mid-1950s that required riders to give up their seats for white passengers when they were asked. One woman refused to give up her seat on December 1st, 1955. This woman was Rosa Parks, and after refusing to give up her seat, she was arrested. Black leaders that night met to organize a boycott of the city bus system, using other ways of getting around. They walked, carpooled, and found other ways to move around while the bus system lost money. By November of 1956, segregation of bus systems was declared unconstitutional, and Martin Luther King Jr., who had led the boycott along with many other African Americans, began boarding buses the next day. Now, it wasn't just happening on an on-the-ground level. It was also this type of civil rights movement was happening on a federal level. There were 2 laws passed in 1957 and 1960 that helped support the right of African Americans to vote. The first was passed in 1957, which made it a federal crime to interfere with anybody's ability to vote. Local officials were required to keep voting records for 22 months after the election in case any charges of voting interference were filed. Another law occurred in 1960, which made it a federal crime to cross state lines while fleeing persecution for hate bombing or other destructive acts. Oversight of elections had historically been a state jurisdiction, but because the states weren't protecting the rights of some Americans, the government stepped in. Unfortunately, these two civil rights laws didn't not have as much effect as they wanted in ensuring that African Americans were allowed to vote, but these and other actions did lead to a movement continuing to gain momentum move into the 1960s, as we'll see whenever we talk about that period next week. Racial segregation, discrimination, and violence was present in the North also, not just in the South. Schools in the North were largely segregated, mostly because of residential patterns. In other words, most communities, African Americans were not allowed to live in white neighborhoods, and thus they didn't attend neighborhood schools with other white children. Black schools in the North were usually not as well equipped and maintained as white schools. One reason for this was that African Americans simply didn't have the political power or clout to force their improvements. During the 1950s, millions of African Americans left the rural South and moved to northern cities, hoping to find jobs and escape poverty and discrimination they had known in the South. But many of them were charged rent for poor quality apartments and houses, discriminated against by employers and labor unions, and occasionally they were the target of racially motivated violence. These issues would become a key part of the civil rights movement of the 1960s, and like I said, we'll be discussing that next week. Let's go into talking a little bit about Eisenhower's foreign policy. Being a military officer, Eisenhower understood the dangers of war and how complex the forces that governed it were in places. The main foreign policy issue during the 1950s involved the Soviet Union, but included other areas of the world. Zelda, no. Joseph Stalin, for example, when talking about the Soviet Union, died on March 5th, 1953, and after much power struggle, Nikita Khrushchev emerged as leader of the premier of the government by 1958. Khrushchev was an enigma, simultaneously denouncing the crimes of the Stalin era while crushing freedom movements in other Soviet countries, such as Hungary. With the United States detonating their first hydrogen bomb, the Soviets also did so just a year later. These developments greatly increased to fear and tensions of a potential catastrophic war. With tensions high over possible confrontations, Eisenhower asked for an exchange of blueprints and allowing of surveillance flights from both sides. The Soviet Union refused this, wanting to keep their secrecy. Eisenhower and Khrushchev made reciprocal visits to each other's countries, even in spite of this, leading to an offer for a summit meeting in 1960. One of the things that actually ended up happening as kind of like a side thing, Khrushchev actually went to Disneyland as one of his places. However, with this offer of a summit meeting, an American spy plane was discovered over Soviet military installations. When the 1960 summit was held, Khrushchev angrily denounced the U.S. and then left. This bitterness ended up continuing in further interactions. In Europe, while Khrushchev indicated that he might allow some autonomy in communist countries under Soviet influence, his actions against Hungary in response to a possible withdrawal from the Warsaw Pact stated otherwise. He ended up going in and having Soviet tanks rumbling into Hungary after they stated that they may withdraw from the Warsaw Pact. The Russians defended their actions at this point in time by saying that they were called in by the legitimate Hungarian government to suppress internal rebellion. There was also issues happening over in the Middle East. The Arab-Israeli conflict in the Middle East had always necessitated delicate moves when dealing with any country in the area. In 1956, we saw Egyptian President Gamal Nasser wanting to help build a dam on the Nile River for irrigation and hydroelectric power. The U.S. offered to make a loan, but retracted this offer when Nasser sought to increase trade with the Soviets. In response to this loss of a loan offer, Nasser seized the Suez Canal in response, and Israel, France, and Great Britain began what was known as the Suez War in response. In response to this war taking place, both the Eisenhower administration and the United Nations called for a ceasefire as quickly as possible, and the Eisenhower Doctrine was put in place. The Eisenhower Doctrine specifically states that the U.S. would help any country in the Middle East being threatened by communist aggression. In Vietnam, Communist leader Ho Chi Minh declared a new government in northern Vietnam. While France and the U.S. supported the change, and France sought a colony in the south, Minh wanted all of Vietnam. The government in the south, led by Day Diem, was corrupt and tyrannical at this point in time. He aided the Viet Cong, a group of communist insurgents in the south who were attempting to overthrow the Diem regime. A conference was later held in response to all of this happening in Vietnam, in Geneva, Switzerland, in July of 1954, involving Russia, Communist China, France, Great Britain, and the governments of Indochina, that agreed to partition Vietnam at the 17th parallel of latitude. Northern Vietnam was accepted as communist, and Southern Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia were recognized as non-communist. The U.S. supported these non-communist nations and developed SEATO, the Southeast Asia Treaties Organization. SEATO was not as strong as NATO, since other member nations were only committed to consult with one another in the event of an attack. And since the largest nations in the group, such as India and Indonesia, didn't participate. But the U.S. had agreed to both to assist France with weapons in its fight against the communists, and now we're committed to resisting communist aggression in Indochina and these types of areas. This isn't to say anything less of anything in Cuba. Because in Cuba, on January 1st, 1959, rebels led by Fidel Castro ousted a corrupt dictator and seized power in Cuba. While the U.S. gave initial support, Castro's actions led to the U.S. breaking diplomatic relationships with Castro's government in Cuba. They confiscated American and other foreign property in Cuba. Castro savagely executed his opponents and established close ties with the Soviet Union. Because of all of these problems, the U.S. instituted both a trade embargo and a breaking of diplomatic relations with Fidel Castro's government. The official relationship between both Cuba and the United States remains unsettled, though limited trade and travel opportunities have opened with the 21st century. Finally, to finish out this whole discussion, let's talk about the space race a little bit. So, America had long prided itself on being the most advanced nation in the world. It had the strongest economy and a well-established tradition of democratic freedom. The United States benefited from advanced technology, but that changed with the launch of Sputnik. Sputnik was the first artificial satellite launched into orbit on October 4th, 1957 by the Soviet Union. Before the U.S. could get to launching their own satellite, this was followed shortly by the launch of Sputnik 2 on November 3rd, 1957. This led to much military development in the way of rockets and satellites. Political, military, and scientific leaders in the U.S. expressed deep concern about what the Soviet leadership in space science and possibly other fields might mean for America and the world. At the time, the US only had the capabilities to launch a rocket that could travel 500 miles. If Russia could put a satellite into space, they feared, it could conceivably put a nuclear weapon onto a rocket and hit the United States. Whenever we talk about the Soviet program in response to the US program, in the response to the US space program, we have to talk about the openness and closeness of both programs. The US was very open about its failures and successes, unlike the Soviet program, who only really showcased its successes. Americans put in the Explorer satellite, and it was launched and went up successfully on January 31st, 1958. This was followed by the Soviet Lunik satellite hitting the moon on September 1959. In an effort to be on par with the Soviet developments, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, otherwise known as NASA, was established in 1958. The 1957-1958 budget also included the largest peacetime military spending program in the nation's history in order to develop short and long-range missiles and missile defense, such as NORAD, the North American Air Defense. This time also saw a greater increase in education budgets to support science, mathematics, and foreign language studies at all levels, from public schools to colleges to graduate programs. This program was known as the National Defense Education Act, and it was passed in 1958. This was the first significant federal assistance to education since 1862, and it opened the doors for further education assistance in the future. But with that, that's about all we have to cover for this week. The last couple of things I want to note: don't forget to take the exams for lessons. This says 21 through 25 in your book, in the presentation. It actually was meant to be lessons 20 through 25. I apologize. But don't forget to take the exams for... It actually would be lessons 21 25. I'm sorry. Don't forget to take the exam for lessons 21 through 25 this week alongside your other assignments. Regardless, Kahoot will be up if you would like to practice for the exam. It'll be posted with the link to your exam. And I wish you good luck for your exams. You all got this. But with that, I'm going to be finishing up, and I will see you guys next week online as we talk further about the civil rights movement. Have a good rest of your week, and stay safe, everyone.